The exceptional talents of James Gillray are like a sunburst lighting up the clouds of 18th century graphic work. His style of caricature is perhaps just as recognisable as indeed were the victims of his engraving tool. The gross distortions of features, the impeccably lettered speech balloons, the sheer joy of the details. Obese, gluttonous princes, grotesque, money-grabbing politicians, and of course their high-wigged wives and mistresses in various states of déshabille. No one was safe from Gillray's engraving tool, scrawling its way across the copper plates. A tumultuous world that was experiencing the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and an equally raging home front that threw up personalities and characters that Gillray found absolutely irresistible. His incredibly popular savage satires of excess, corruption and sexual intrigue could be called the celebrity magazines of his day. Only, of course, Gillray's engraved prints were of outstanding quality in both artistic and literary execution. James Gillray was born into the Chelsea of 1776, into a very strict religious sect. The Moravians were extremely unattractive, decrying any attempt at pleasure or joy. They concentrated instead on just wanting to die so they could be relieved of the pressure of having to deal with the world around them. The confusion and restrictions of his childhood naturally gave Gillray the necessary impetus to break the bonds and strike out on his own. He was so well equipped to be a caricaturist, but, like Hogarth before him, Gillray started out as a letter engraver. Far too monotonous for him, he joined a band of strolling players, but the hardships of a life on the road brought him to London and study at the Royal Academy. Quite unlike his contemporaries, Gillray exaggerated the physical attributes of his victims. The lengthening of a nose, the rounding of an already spherical bottom, thin men getting thinner, fat men becoming simply portentous. For many years, Gillray lived with his publisher, Mrs. Humphreys, in St. James Street, who, on seeing just how much money he could make for her, obliged him for his every need. No doubt she probably posed for him in big coats with gold coins spilling out of the capacious pockets. Later, as the once insatiable trade in the prints declined, Mrs. Humphreys was able to take out loans by depositing the copper plates with the creditors. Gillray became a cause célèbre, not only in England but also across the continent, sometimes at great risk, considering who he was satirising in his speech bubbles and straplines. The last of his work is dated 1811, and not long after he descended into madness, on one occasion hurling himself out of an upper story window of Mrs. Humphreys' shop. James Gillray died in 1815 and was buried in his local church, St. James, between Piccadilly and Jermyn Street. He was 58 years old. Mrs. Humphreys' cash cow had gone, but leaving her the inheritance of Gillray's work. As times grew harder, she tried to sell the copper plates at auction, but there was little interest and she withdrew them from the sale room. Mrs. Humphreys offered them to Mr. H.G. Bohn for £800. He offered her £500, but even though she was, by this time, in no real position to argue, she turned him down. 3 years later she relented, but Mr. Bohn had had enough, and after Mrs. Humphreys' death, her executors sold them as just a load of old copper. The money raised was about 500 shillings, as opposed to pounds. Bohn heard of this transaction, and the plates were rescued, in the nick of time, out of the skip, as we might say now. Bohn must have been delighted that London was filled with potential customers descending on the capital for the Great Exhibition in the same year. It is a selection of these prints that are now offered for sale by the Goldmark Gallery, exquisitely hand-coloured, using references from Gillray's originals that were originally coloured by coteries of Gillray's London ladies. The influence of Gillray should never be underestimated. One can find a direct line of biting satire from Gillray to the scratchy black ink of Gerald Scarfe, say, or Ralph Steadman. And the sheer unexpected impact on Gillray's public can equally be likened to the weeks when the BBC first bravely broadcast That Was the Week That Was in the 1960s. Satire, society, gross humour and excess. It's all here in these wonderful coloured engravings. There are in fact only 5 of the original copper plates still in existence, but Gillray still reaches out to us from the tumultuous and noisy 18th century.